All right, everybody. Good morning and or good afternoon, depending upon where you're at. And welcome to today's KAMIND webinar, CMMC, the clock is ticking. I wanted to start by wishing everybody a happy 2023 New Year, since this is our first webinar of the new year. My name is Mike Class, and I'm an account manager here at KAMIND IT. Before we get rolling today, a couple of housekeeping items. There will be time for Q&A at the end. So if you can our microphone on mute during the presentation, that would be excellent. With many of us still working from home, we'd like to eliminate all possible background noises and distractions. If you have any questions mid-presentation today, please feel free to use the chat functionality or the raise hand icon, and we'll be sure to weave your question into the presentation best we can. This is kind of important. We will be recording today's webinar. So if you're uncomfortable with this, now would be your opportunity to opt out. If you'd like a recording of today's webinar, please let me know, and we'd be happy to get that over to you. Now with that out of the way, let's get down to business. So we've been on this CMMC journey now for almost 2 years, and the clock is definitely ticking. Some questions you might have that will hopefully be answered on today's webinar. What's significant about October 1st, 2025? What updates have there been to CMMC compliance standard in the last 2 years? And what's a good way to get started if you haven't done anything yet to start towards your CMMC compliance and certification? So again, hopefully those questions will be answered on today's webinar. So please sit back and relax, and let's hear our president and CEO, Mr. Matt Katzer, start the conversation today on CMMC. The clock is ticking. Please take it away, Matt. We can't hear you, Matt.
You know, I should wear that shirt says you're on mute, and I guess it's getting used to doing the webinars again. And after this great 3-day weekend of January 1st and Christmas, and now we're getting back to business. You know, when we looked at putting CMC and putting the presentation together this year, the material, it really is a clock is ticking. And the reason why I talk about this, we'll go through what's the current update, because there's some things that have not changed. One is that if you are a defense contractor, you have to basically file a SPURS score, and you have to be compliant with NIST 800-171, and you have to basically have a POAM for all the areas of the NIST 800-171 that you do not meet. That is a DFARS rule, it's a DFARS requirement, and the only issue that has been saving grace for the community at large is that DIGCAT hasn't been enforcing it. So let's go to figure out what the changes are, what's happening in this, what's going to happen in March when when we expect the interim ruling to come out. So first of all, for those who don't know, KAMIND IT, we're a cloud-first company. Basically, we're 4th year running on the Inc. 5000, but also what's interesting in terms of the Microsoft licensing, we're one of the 235 direct license reseller in the United States. And we're also one of the 52 people that are actually authorized to sell AOSG licenses or GCC high licenses for the defense community. And some little history about us. We publish a number of books. Our Office 365 books are really popular. Over 280,000 of those have been sold. But the purpose of today is trying to figure out what do we need to do and why. And some of this is a little bit of probably a repeat, but I want to kind of put everything in play and kind of put it in perspective of why and what's happening and what can we expect and everything else, because there's been a lot of changes. One of the changes, for example, when you look for CMC specifications, you would go to the acquisition site, for instance. That's no longer the case because DoD took that over, so we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. But when you look in terms of what's happening, this is kind of my favorite slide that kind of explains the whole basis of what's going on. The whole strategy as you look through what's happening with CMC or cybersecurity in general and compliance is this whole concept of Originally, we would actually put security as an add-on. We would pair different third-party products together to try to plug the holes and everything else. And what DoD was trying to do, and the rest of the community is trying to do now, is you build cybersecurity as a foundational piece on it. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters a couple different answers. If you're in the commercial segment and you basically have nothing to do with defense contracts, you have to deal with cybersecurity liability claims and liability insurance because you have to protect the company against third-party claim. The same methodologies and standards that we use on the defense side is what we use on the commercial side. You now get the point that insurance companies are actually going through and they're saying, hey, have you implemented an MFA? You fill out your little application, say, yeah, 100%. And suddenly you have a claim, and what they want to have happen, they will come back to you and say, hey, great, you got a claim. Give us the object evidence to prove that you've implemented what you have done, said you've done. That's what's the change is happening. That's what's the changes when you look at NIST 800-171, you look at cybersecurity in general, you look at CMMC, everything is about proof of execution. So bear that in mind as we go through in 23, because that's why everybody is looking at. It's not good enough to attest to something. You have to be able to attest and subject to verification. That's the change. So a little bit in rules in place. A lot of you know in terms of the interim rule for the defense DFAR regulation in terms of what covered defense information and the methodologies used to protect that information. This is pretty standard. Now, what's happened is you see this URL here, DoD CIO. So what's happened is that this is a link for the new link for all the different DFAR rules that you as a contractor are subject to. And in terms of what you actually need to do in terms of implementation. Now, if you have CUI, you need to follow the security requirements in NIST 800-171. Very clear, and it's very straight about what you need to do. And if you look at some of the other types of rules that have since then, is that basically in terms of the SPRS requirements. So you have to now just actually say that you have implemented, you actually have to follow through and say, okay, what am I doing? What is the POAMs associated with it? And then also from a standpoint, the change in terms of one of the changes that happened last year was the ability for the government now to basically come into facilities to basically verification of the implementation. So now you have a situation where you have to implement in NIST 800-171, you have to prove it, and the DoD now has the ability to spot check facilities in terms of actually happening, what's being implemented and what's not being implemented. Now you go in terms of when CMMC came out, that's when they set the timeline for the dates. So October 1st of 2025, that date hasn't moved. And also from a standpoint in terms of the change that actually will happen with all the interim rules is just reinforcing NIST 800-171 as requirements protecting CUI. So those are the things that we have in place. That's the environment that we actually have. So the question is, what's really changing and what's really going on? Now, after January 1st, what happened is the acquisition site, you used to go to the acquisition site to actually get the information. Now we actually go to the DoD CIO site for the CIO from the information officer, what's going on in DoD, what is the timeline and everything else. As they're still following through. And that's why we're all looking at what's happening is this rulemaking process. And so they're limiting changes, but the big change that we expect, and the word on the street is this is going to happen in March, is they're going to basically follow what they're going to publish the rules, and they'll have 60 days before they get implemented. That's a feeling of what's going to happen. So the NIST 800-171 is not going away. The big question that people have is this timeline going to change? And the word on the street is the timeline's not going to change. So we're going to be scrambling to look in terms of how do we actually get the assessments and how do we actually get the necessary pieces in place. So all of us as an organization, even for us in the commercial that do both commercial and defense contractor work, we have to implement NIST 800-171 as a fundamental policy and process model in everything that we do. And that's how the market's going. That's how the demand being placed on us by the federal government. And it's the demands also in the commercial side. It's what's being placed on by the insurance companies. Because insurance companies now want proof, just like the defense contractor or DoD when they do an audit. They want proof of execution. So you have to get in the mindset of not only doing what you're supposed to do, but also have the necessary discipline that prove that you have actually done it with the necessary documentation and proof of execution documents. So and what does that mean from a practical sense? Well, let's say you have firewalls in your business. You have firewall, and you're going to update the firewalls. Well, you have to go now and prove that you updated the firewalls. What was the old version? What was the new version? What was the date stamp when you updated? Those are the things that we actually have to do from a maturity model in all our businesses and how we actually handle things. Now, looking what's on the acquisition site in terms of the new DoD CIO site, they have this comment, which is basically new that, in terms of everything is kind of notational until after the rulemaking is completed. So some people are saying, hey, this gives us time to make changes. Some people, I'm not going to do anything till after I hear the final rule. The reality is, what we're hearing is, if you're not doing the NIST 800-171, you are going to be behind the curve. And that's the practical reality of it. Now, there's been some other changes too. And one of the changes that we actually have is, and this is from the DoD CIO, I thought this was a good pictorial in terms of what they're trying to do, streamlining the model, but you notice it's based on NIST. Reduce the assessment costs. Again, trying to use level 2 or level 3. And they have this other thing about doing self-assessments at level 2, which is a questionable one right now because DoD has already has changed their position on this. And also allow POAM milestones if you're actually doing it level 1. So you're trying to get this flexible. They're trying to figure out what the community actually need, but with all the pressures going on in terms of what's going on overseas in Asia, what's going on overseas in Europe, and what's happening in terms of the infrastructure. How do we actually have to protect ourselves? How do we actually put things in place? So what's a diagram originally on what we've heard in terms of the NIST 800. So you could actually do a level 2, but you could do a self-attest. But what DoD did at the town hall meeting last year in February is they basically said there's not going to be any level 2 self-assessment because they can't figure out how to do it. So if you're looking at level 2, you're going to pretty much go through a third-party assessor. And if you're going to be level 1, you're going to have to do your annual self-assessment, and it's an annual self-assessment. Now, keep in mind, if you're doing level 2, you have to do level 1 and you do level 2, so you do both. If I look in terms of what Microsoft has actually said or what's happening in the market, they basically had, and I highlighted this comment, and let me expand it so you can see a little bit better, but basically they said in the town hall, they're basically the thoughts about being able to do a level 2 self-assessment is looking stark. So if you're planning to do a self-assessment for level 2, you need to reset your expectations and basically figure out how you want to actually partner up with a C3PO, partner up with an assessment organization, do a pre-test. Because there's changes that are happening. Now, the other thing that DoD said in terms of they published this kind of a new change on the site for the time making, because everybody says, oh, what's the rules and everything else. This is their official statement, but they basically haven't really suspended the efforts going through in terms of the dates. Now, when do we expect to hear a ruling from DoD? Well, we expected something in November, didn't happen. March sounds like the new date where everybody is expecting to have the rule. But basically, until they actually make a change, the 2025 date still is the schedule. Now, what's happened between now and, between 2 years ago, the various rulemaking activities and what's gone on into the market? Well, a lot of things have happened. In terms of going from a CCP exam, that's a CMC certified professional and assessor exams. Those have started last year. The first one was in October, and that's when the beta exam's out. So you now have a limited number of assessors going through it. The voluntary CMC assessment started in September. And then also in terms of happening. So organizations can actually go through a voluntary assessment. Like even for ourselves, we're doing our pre-tests. We're validating our CMC level 1. We're validating our policy and processes for level 2. We're changing those and tweaking those and adding extensions to them. Those are the things that you want to do. You want to use the time to get those pieces in place now. And the big thing that people have is they expect in March 2023 is that when they expect the CMC to actually, the DoD to make their interim ruling. And if they make the interim ruling, that means within 60 days, that's what we're going to have for public content. It'll go through the process, go through the government, through the Senate representative to kind of decide and discuss about this before it comes law. But literally 60 days later, it will be law. So assume that happens in July. So you have this timeline where you're going to rush and trying to figure out the pieces. So you need to lay out your strategy and start now before it's too late, because the clock is ticking and it's not going to change. Now, if you look at some of the other things that are happening, there's rumors that they're saying that they're going to provide incentives for contractors and subcontractors for the conversion of the CMC 2.0. Great. We'll see what happens when that actually happens on it. And if some of the long-term defense contractor says, yeah, right, they'll just tag it into the existing things and not really change anything. But the key thing to remember, where you are now, the NIST 800-171 is the base security requirement. That is what you need to be doing. You're reporting your SPUR score, you're doing your self-attestation right now. And basically, you need to start getting more rigor and putting the discipline in what you need to do, because that's really where it's based on. Because while CMC level 1 is basically the 17 controls and 6 domains of the NIST 800-171, and what level 2 is the other 93 controls and domains associated that weren't part of level 1. So it's still the entire 110 controls.
Hey, man,
So
we have a question, and the question is the May 2023 CMMC due date, has that been changed?
No.
Oh, okay.
The dates of the original timeline dates, there has been no changes in the timeline. So the big question that everyone's asking, will DoD adjust the timeline in the interim ruling in March 2023? That's when we expect it. Now, DoD may make it March when they announce it, maybe April or May. We're expecting it in March is where the feeling from the community is. But, DoD will do what DoD wants to do. But the timeline that exists now is the timeline. It hasn't changed.
Okay,
so
great. Good question.
Yeah. So that's why it's really, and also from a standpoint, there has been nothing to change the fact that all defense contractors need to file SPUR scores, need to be NIST 800-171 compliant. And also, if you actually have CUI, there's additional safeguards and monitoring that you need to put in place for CUI under the current DFARS regulations. So a lot of the things going on, and it gets kind of interesting with the conflict and going on overseas and Asia and going on in terms of Europe and the amount of funding that's going into the defense sector. The question is, you ask yourself, are they going to change the rules because we're getting into this model where cyber attacks and attacks in organizations are becoming more and more common, and how do we actually protect the country? And that's where things are coming from. So you have to kind of figure out your strategy and figure out what it is and build it into your culture of cybersecurity as a fundamental basis. Regardless of what happens, you're going to be implementing security controls because you need to do so to actually run your business. So And when you look from our standpoint, we look at CMC level 1 and level 2, we apply the same concepts in commercial because get right down to it, you're talking about the NIST framework. And the NIST framework requires we got to have everything on MFA. You can't use certain types of authentication. You have to change things. These are just business decisions we need to make that to reduce our business risk because the cost of a incident at a business puts us personally, the corporations, and personally the people in the company as a business, because we as business owners are responsible for the care and feeding the employees that we actually have. And if we want to look at ways that we want to reduce the business risks of the organization, and that basically is how we actually take care of folks and take care of ourselves and our businesses. So looking at the release level 1 model, and really it's a foundational model. And so we came up with ourselves, we have a DIY kit, which what is basically the fundamental, the policy and procedures you need. We tailored ours, of course we do 365, we tailored ours to basically Microsoft Office 365. So it's implemented in that, but it's also structured to give you the methodology and tools you need to collect the object evidence. Those are the pieces that you have. And the reason why we use the GRC tool, and yeah, you can use Excel spreadsheets or SharePoint or whatever, but what we discovered in terms of how we manage things and manage our clients, you need a GRC tool. You need a single point of truth that everybody can go to say, this is what the process, this is what we're doing, and also forces a consistent process implementation in the organization, which is crucial because you can no longer have, person A do it one way, person B do it another way. You have to be exact, you have to follow through, because with the changes in terms of what the current administration done with the Whistleblowing Act, if you don't implement things or say you file an incorrect SPUR scores, the organization's now liable, but also because of the changes in the law, when you file a SPUR score, the CEO has to sign off, the C staff has to sign off on those things, specifically the owner of the company or the CEO, and they are now personally liable for their implementation of it. That's the changes that have really happened. And so we came up with the DIY kit to kind of get that pieces in place. And it was really, and there's different folks has a similar configuration. We chose ours to basically built on what we're doing and how to make sure it going. And we're using that DIY kit to go through our assessments to make sure that we have all the pieces docked up. And on the technical side, what it really means when you look at the NIST framework is the best thing is follow in terms of the Microsoft placemat. And what this really tells you is what type of controls do you implement? What do we actually need to do? Now, this is level 1. Level 1 is not that difficult to do. And quite honestly, you should be doing this already. You should have the processes in place. You should have everything implemented. This should be just your culture. Now, on the commercial side, which is interesting, when we actually look at talking to the cyber insurance companies, and we're doing cyber liability through Lloyd's of London or which organization you want to actually have your policy underwritten by, this is what they also are demanding to have done. They want the same thing. They want proof of execution. They want to make sure that you've implemented MFA. You want to make sure you got rid of all legacy hardware. You want to make sure you basically protected the environment. So there's a situation that happened. This is on the medical side. There was a situation that happened where someone's implementing full, followed like doing the HIPAA, trying HIPAA high trust and make sure the MFA is fully implemented. This organization probably about 300 to 400 people. And what happened is 2 doctors decided they didn't want to deal with MFA because it was too difficult. Well, they got breached. And what happened is that when they actually filed for their insurance claim to go cover their breach, the insurance company basically demanded proof of execution, and they discovered the 2 doctors that didn't have the MFA implemented. And as a result of it, they denied the claim. Now, what does that mean from a dollar standpoint? Well, when you talk about, in this specific case, when you talk about health records, every record you have to do a notification. In this case, they had probably 1 million records they had to send out to different clients and everything else. The cost of record notification is probably about $50 a piece. So it cost them roughly $25 to $50 million of costs that the business had to absorb to notify the breach occurred. Those are the business risks that you're dealing with. And when you talk about what's going on with CMC level 2 and you're talking about suppliers and everything else, it's just not DoD, but it's how you do business with other people. How do you do business with states? How do you do business with, with other vendors and clients? And this is really what we're talking about when we talk about risk in cyber environment. So when we actually look at CMC level 2, I'm off on a little sidetrack, but we basically roll the whole concept in terms of a GRC tool. And this is future feed that basically says, do we have the controls up and running? It's not just the controls, it's the ability to actually import the evidence to show proof of execution. So if we had an incident that did happen, we can actually prove that we did what we're supposed to do, and the claim would be covered, because that's what it's all about. It's about reducing business risk. And a lot of the questions people ask about is that, what about level 2? Well, with CMC level 2, the bar gets raised. So if you're actually dealing with CUI, and CUI is and there's different loose versions of it. That's really incorrect, but sometimes what happens is that you'll get an invoice from the Department of Defense, and they'll send an invoice to you and they'll just stamp it CUI. But there's really marking that has to be redacted, and you have to actually go challenge some of the documents you receive if they haven't been marked correctly in CUI. And this is a redacted version of what the marking actually look like. But let's say you have some CUI in store. Where can you actually store it electronically in the cloud? And there's different discussions on it. From a Microsoft standpoint, Microsoft really has two clouds. There's a commercial cloud and there's the government cloud. And the government cloud basically, and the main thing on the government cloud is this piece right here, dedicated US support. Where in the commercial cloud, it's global support. So you have non-US citizens accessing the tenants or doing support services. That's really the difference with the two. But when you actually look in terms of how this blows up from the service organizations, you actually see that in terms of where, continental US and where the data centers are located. But see the commercial side, it can be in continental US or it can be out overseas. But in terms of what happens in terms of the encryption, in terms of capabilities in GCC high, basically it's a US sovereign cloud. Now, what's kind of a side thing, what's going on with Microsoft, they took the same concept of sovereign clouds. Now you have a sovereign cloud in France, you got a sovereign cloud in Germany, you have different countries of the world are having their pieces on it. So you actually look at that from an organization flow, so that's kind of the change. Now, some of the other things that you actually have in looking at it is this key areas you want to look in terms of, does it meet the DFARS in terms of DFARS 7012? Well, here you can actually get it in GCC, but at GCC high. But now you actually start looking in terms of how do you actually get the different security levels that you actually need. And here's the other one that people really forget about is ITAR compliance. So if you have data that's subject to ITAR, you're going to be in GCC high. You don't need to implement CMC level 2. You want to make sure, you probably should implement, but you don't have to go through attestation unless it's specified in your contract. But you want to basically put yourself in an environment where you have built the organization to do what you need to do. Now, when you look at CMMC, when you look at 365 E5, for instance, Microsoft has this technical reference manual and placement that tells you what needs to get done on the different pieces so you can actually see what is actually implemented. So and then gives you an idea. And again, we use a GRC tool. So when you actually do the implementation, you can actually see, hey, I've implemented various parts of the controls. I have not implemented. So you actually see us as a screenshot of where you're going. Now, given the thing that people have to remember is that when you actually want to go against like the NIST 800 framework, this is not something you go hire someone and you write a check and it's be done by Monday. This is going to take you months. It's going to take you weeks, months, and maybe even years, depending on the organization size and the complexity, because you're fundamentally changing the organization structure, how you handle cybersecurity. So the question that people ask is, what's the best way to proceed? And how do you actually get to a level 2 if you're looking at the NIST 800? Well, it's really very simple. Start at the basics, which you all should be doing right now. start to focus on CMC levels 1. Get the structure in place and decide how you best want to handle the organization. It's a fairly low-level lift, what you need to do, and it's a stuff you should be doing anyway, and you're required to do all this stuff for your cyber liability policies. So all you're really asking now is that the proof of the execution that you're doing what you're supposed to do and document the whole process. And so from a process standpoint, when you actually look at starting the CMC level 1, it's easy to actually go into level 2, because once you look at that, the next decision is that you have to say, do I have level 2 stuff or do I not? And the question is, if I'm only doing level 1, then be in 365 commercial. If I'm doing level 2, then I go in GCC high. And if you actually are implementing your GRC tool, it's easy to track what you are. And that's kind of the secret. And then when you actually get the pieces in place that you build your level 1 organization, which you all should be doing right now, and hopefully you are doing that, then basically it's really just time to focus on it. You may actually take different strategies of converting the entire company, or you may convert just small portions of the company in enclave. Parts of it doesn't matter. The key thing is that you have to start the process, and there's a timeline you're executing against. And when we actually look in terms of from a Microsoft standpoint, that's what the placemat does. It helps us, guides us through that, so we actually make the right decision. Now, when we talk about the implementation from a technical standpoint, there's a 500-page document that Microsoft published, and they basically make all those things available, what you need to do. Now, what's going on, and most people haven't internalized this, is Microsoft's a defense contractor as well. So they're going through the whole process of making their 365 E5 suite, make sure that meets level 2, but also they're shooting for level 3. So when you look in terms of what they're trying to do, all those features and functionalities they change flow down in GCC high. They do the implementation. One of the features they added recently in the Microsoft 365 E5 is basically data loss protection for endpoint. It's not in the commercial side, it's in the GCC high, and soon you'll see it in the commercial side. So what's happening is a bar's being raised about how to do, and what DLP is, a data loss protection of what you need to do to tell what data is being accessed, who's accessing what data, how can you actually manage CUI, but take it from a different perspective. When you think of data loss protection, you can have company proprietary information, you could have vendor proprietary information and client, and you start using the same methodologies and mindset to protect that information, because we are all custodians of our clients' data, because that's how we grow our business and manage our business. And then once you actually kind of look in terms of level 2, it's kind of look the structure. Do you build an enclave? An enclave would be, for instance, is you have a GCC high tenant, you basically do an implementation of an Azure Virtual Desktop or a Windows 365 Cloud PC. So it's totally isolated. So CUI is totally isolated in that environment, because that you would get that whole environment to basically, so you have a much controlled environment. So the company ends up being a level 1 company in the commercial side, and then you may have a small subset that's in GCC high. Now, over time, you may convert the entire company to the GCC high, but what you want from a strategy, what you want to start is get the fundamental processes in place and build the culture for the company, and then slowly are changing it, figure out which tools you want to use, which tools you have FedRAMP. For example, we use Keeper Security. Why do we use Keeper Security versus LastPass? Well, Keeper Security is FedRAMP compliant, and it basically, we can use that in the federal sector. LastPass, we can't. Now, there's maybe other issues, and there's been some trade in terms of the market and everything else, and some of the news that you hear. Those are different issues, but fundamentally, you have to look at all the tools you use, everything you do, and say, is this compliant? Is it not compliant? Is this the right solution? As we go into 2023, we're looking at the evaluation at the same time. We're saying which tools you want to use. How do you want to do this? These are all fundamental decisions that we have to make and we have to decide. So the process flow is really figure out and basically build this environment, and then basically go through a C3PO certification after you've done a pretest. But don't forget, under the DFARS clause, because you have CUI, you have to add a continuous management security model. So you're going to either use a third party to provide security management, you're going to do it internally. However you do it, you have to actually do it, and it has to be a rigor process, and it has to be documented with proof of execution that things are happening. So the questions that we ask a lot of time is, how do you get started? Well, it's really not that difficult. And I've been harping over or saying this one thing all the time. Start with either a DIY kit from us, you can do it someone else. Get the level 1 implementation in your environment and put the processes in place. Build your policy and practices. Go through an attestation test, go through a pre-test with a third party, but you want to get the fundamental structure in place that you can build on. Then once you do that, then you basically can decide what you want to do for level 2. In level 2, you have the problem of, if you're in a commercial side for level 1 and you have ITAR, or if you have CUI, you're going to basically be in GCC high. And that's going to be the decision point that you have to make. The next step after that is basically the implementation. Now you can take your time on it, but the key thing is you follow 2 documents. One is the Microsoft Technical Reference Manual for CMC 2.0, and the other document you follow is the CMC Placemat. And that gives you the idea of the subscriptions and everything else that you pick. Now, we get asked a lot of times of costs. So I've been polling the market over the past couple months and trying to see what people charge for different things. So what I did, I put kind of a cost things together. Now this changes all the time, but one of the things you have, remember, if you're in a supply and demand market, as the supply minimizes and the demand increases, prices are going to go up. So if the November date doesn't change, which I don't think it will, you're going to see prices probably escalate, because there's roughly 300,000 companies that have to go through either a level 1 or level 2 certification process. And right now there's only 380 assessors, and they're probably less than 21 C3PO companies. And DIBCAC already has decided that they're only going to do the level 3, and level 2 is going to be done through a third party, and level 1 is going to be self-attestation. So you got to figure out what's your strategy. So we're typically fine. You're going to do to get started, you're going to do it. If you do it yourself, you probably won't have the expense of a DIY kit, but you do something like a DIY kit, then you're going to have to go through and build out the CMC level 2 technical reference, and you can file the Microsoft technical reference guide. And that's going to be really in your GCC high, and you'll have a migration. And with that, you're going to have an incremental on top of it. You're going to build a set of policies and processes for that. So you have your level 2 policies. And then as you go through, and that will give you the IT policy and plans, but also the ability of what documents get uploaded, what is the process, what's the tools you need, because it's not just the policy and procedures it is about how the information is collected and uploaded into your GRC tool. That's the other piece as well, and that's the piece that takes IT time and engineering time. And then the third part is that because of the DFARS and 7012 requirements, you're going to have to put basically continuous monitoring in place. And then on top of it, you're going to have to go through, once you get all this done, you'll probably spend additional dollars on a pre-test, make sure you got all your check marks and I's dotted and T's crossed. And then you're going to go through a C3PO certification. And that's how you're going to get certified. And that's kind of the cost record to build it out. And then basically is, and you're going to have to start somewhere. And this is, for instance, for us, it's a DIY kit. That's where we start with everyone. Even our commercial clients, we start with our DIY kit, because the structure is the same. You need it on the commercial side. You need it on the DoD side. So how do you get started? I'll open up for questions now, but really it's you got to start with level 1. And then basically you got to figure out what's your strategy is for GCC high license. Do you even need it or not? And then build out, if you do need it, you start building out the level 2 against a technical reference guide. Now, what we've seen some people have done is say, hey, I'm just going to be level 1, but I will go build out my level 1 infrastructure against the MS technical reference guide. Well, that's what we do in our guard security plan, for instance. So a lot of it depends. You have to look at your strategy. It's about reducing business risk.
Great. Thank you, Matt, for a very informative CMMC overview. Everybody, feel free to come off mute. And if you have any questions, we'd love to hear your questions. I'll actually start with a question I came up with. So Matt, you had mentioned if you're a CMMC level 2 environment that you need 7x24 continuous monitoring and management. Do you know any company that might do that?
Well, I mean, when you look at it, it's when we talk about like our guard security, for instance, we do that functions. There's a couple other companies that do it as well. But it basically gives you have to monitor everything else and basically provide remediation and incident reports and everything else. We do that service, for instance, in our Fortress G offering of our security products.
Great answer. All right. Who's brave? We need some questions to answer. If you're thinking it, probably everybody else is too. So, please unmute, ask away, or if you're feeling a little shy, you can type it in the chat window.
Yeah. The key thing everyone needs to internalize is that, and I talk to over and over again, if you haven't basically embraced doing the NIST 800-171 framework as a basis of your cybersecurity and even your IT management plan, you need to be doing this. And even if you're not going through a self-attestation and everything else, you want to embrace that anyway, because this is what you're going to need. More and more, we're seeing as we go through all the cyber liability insurance applications we see from different companies and that supply us, they're all basically right around the NIST 800-171 framework. You're going to have to implement it. And when you talk about cyber liability insurance, what you're really talking about the third-party risk. And what that means is that if you lose a record or something happens in your record, you supply it to a vendor, they lose a record, you want to get third-party liability protection so that when you don't get sued by, let's say you have a client that basically had a data breach based on information you supplied, you actually are liable for that information. So you can actually be picked up. That's what the cyber liability policies are for. It's there's data protection, say data policies to restore the environment, and the third-party liability, which to me are the scary ones, is basically that's to make sure that if you get tagged in a litigation that you have done the necessary pieces to prove that you protected the client information. And this is all that's going on. It get cut through all the certification and everything else. This is really what's going on in the environment. It's about business risk reduction.
So again, got about 10:45, so we'd love to hear your questions and answer any questions you might have.
I'm sure you've already said this. When will the like the DoD contracts be like? When will this have to be implemented by?
Well, that's a good question. Right now, they haven't changed the dates. The date still is November 1st of 2025. Under the original rule, under the latest ruling is that implementation you have to basically get certification in order to get the 2025 contracts. Now, the way the contract works is that there's a cycle, so it's going to be in the contracts of 2025. A lot of those vendors are picked in 2020 and before November 1st. So there's about a 6-month leadway before things happen if you follow the pundits about what's happening, way DoD does contracts. But basically, you're going to find yourself not being able to bid on contracts. You're not going to not be able to, if you get a contract and be awarded it, you're not going to meet the requirements to basically execute against it. And that's what's going to happen. And that's the biggest fear for folks, or you're going to have to get an exception. Now, the question is, are the exceptions going to be what type of exceptions? In the old days, you had these evergreen, everlasting exceptions. DoD already said those are not going to exist anymore. So, and the town hall last year, when they had their DoD town hall, they also said that basically don't plan to have POAMs if you're going for level 2 certification.
Good question, Terrence. Thank you. So Matt, I got another question. Let's say I currently have a DoD contract and I've been told now that I need to be CMMC level 2 to keep it intact. So that means I need the Microsoft Enclave, the GCC high licenses. I'm putting, all my data in the GCC government data center via Microsoft. How do I access that data from the West Coast when I know that happens to be an East Coast data center? I mean, what's the pipe or the conduit to get me to that data?
Well, there's actually multiple government data centers in the U.S. There's Arizona, for instance. There's one in Washington. There's Northern California. So there's different Azure government data centers. And I almost stuck a slide for that in the deck to show where they are. So it's accessing no different than you do any Office 365 tenant. The biggest issue that you have if you're doing things like integrating to your on-premise environments, you have to make sure your IP addresses are whitelisted basically for access. There's configuration things that you actually have to do, which is not very clear until you actually do a number of migrations. So those pieces, and these are new features that, and I use the term features, because as Microsoft has gone through with a number of attacks and everything against their data centers, they basically put more restrictions on it. So now you have to validate if you're doing an on-prem VPN tunnel, you got to make sure that both sides are registered. So there's a lot of rules in place, but you can access the Microsoft data network, continental US, continental data center, and really kind of figure out where you want to actually put your workloads and everything else in Azure Gov and 365.
Hey, and also we also see a lot of businesses out there really, and I want to, for lack of better words, it's almost like a white glove or sanitized glove approach to when they operate in that environment, that they're very, very careful. And those are the things that you need to think about, is you have a very clean environment that you access that thing. You don't just allow anybody into it. And I believe it's called an enclave, and it's a safe place where the clients go in to do their development environment. They don't mix their code. They don't mix their things in that environment. And it's a good practice, and it's becoming, there's a lot of experiences out there. We've got that, experience how to put those enclaves out there. I don't think they have an official word yet, Matt. It's not white glove. It's more like a medical glove approach to making certain it's a clean and secure environment.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a good point from that standpoint as well. I mean, there's a lot of changes on it. As the key thing is that when you step back at it, it's fundamentally looking at your business. And as a business owner, you're CEO of a company, you start saying, okay, how can I reduce the risk of my organization to make sure that my business is viable in case something happens? And it's about reducing business risk. And that's probably the biggest fear that we all have, setting cyber security aside and everything else and people access, but it's really the business risk, and it's the third-party litigation. You got to do the necessary things to protect your business and be good stewards for clients' data. That's the rule number one. And with the changes in the federal laws and everything else, and even on the commercial side, it's about all the Whistleblowing Act, all the negligence stuff now affecting everyone. So you got to do what you're saying you got to do and prove that you did what you did.
All right, not a lot of time left. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask away. We'd love to hear your questions.
Yeah. And I just reading one thing. So when the interim rule comes out in March, assume that's a date, 60 days after that interim rule will when the that will becomes law, and that would be the new basis of everything that's happened. And so that may adjust the 2025 date, but no one thinks it will adjust the 2025 date.
All right, going once, going twice. Any other questions you guys might have? I'd like to mention, I get calls all the time. People need FedRAMP or they need SOC 2 or, other compliances out there. And the do-it-yourself kit is a great, building tool to lay the foundation of the house, so to speak, before you, go to step 2, which is more in tune with whatever compliance you're going after. And a lot of organizations need to hit multiple compliances. So once you got one checked off, it's really easy to pick up the second and third one. They're very similar. All righty then. Looks like it's about 10:55. We'll give you back 5 minutes. We really appreciate you joining us today. Hope it was beneficial for you. And we really look forward to seeing you on the next KAMIND webinar. On that note, have a great day and thank you very much.
Yeah, and don't forget to fill out our feedback at www.kamind.com/feedback and get a copy of our latest white paper and enclave papers.
Very good. You guys have a great day. Thank you.